VisualPolitik community, what is happening in Poland could change the balance of power across the European continent. This country has decided to break the mold, beat all records, and increase its military spending to levels never seen before. Pay close attention. Poland is probably the European country that suffered the most during the 20th century. It was invaded by the Russians, by the Germans. It was divided, destroyed, and bore the brunt of the Second World War. And to top it off, it ended up being subjugated to 50 long years of Soviet communism. Destruction, and above all, ruin, accompanied this country for most of the 20th century. And that's why you can believe me when I tell you that Poles are not willing to let history repeat itself under any circumstances. And that is exactly why this country has left the whole of NATO open-mouthed. How? Well, with news like this.
Poland to spend 5% of GDP on defense in 2025, says Foreign Minister.
A whopping 5% of GDP. You heard correctly. The Poles are ready to invest almost $50 billion in defense by 2025. Yes, that's right. The same amount as much richer countries like South Korea. It's a crazy figure. In relative terms, it amounts to almost the same military effort as Russia's, 50% more than that of the United States, and twice that of the South Koreans. And this, what's more, represents a radical change, a 180-degree turn. The Poles have set out to move from having one of the most antiquated and poorly equipped armed forces in Europe to one of the most modern. But do you know what? They don't want to do it the way we all would probably think. Let me explain. Lately, the trend in Western countries is to invest more in air power and unmanned technologies, leaving aside traditional ground armies. More drones, fewer tanks, more aircraft, less artillery. In fact, many countries are cutting the size of their territorial armies precisely to free up resources to improve the other branches of their armed forces. Nevertheless, Poland is doing the opposite. There are more and more ground soldiers, and the idea is that they will continue to grow in number. Take a look at this crazy graphic. In just 4 years, I repeat, in just 4 years, Poland has practically doubled the size of its armed forces. According to the Polish government, by 2024, they already had 216,000 professional personnel. What's more, Poland is expected to end 2024 with the third largest armed forces in all of NATO, behind only the United States and Turkey. But the idea is to go further. Warsaw aims to reach 300,000 soldiers in the not too distant future. And guess what? There were those who thought that this whole gamble was nothing more than a strategy to try to scrape votes by the party that, until recently, governed Poland, the Nationalist Law and Justice Formation. However, in contrast to this assumption, the truth is that the new Prime Minister, the centre-right Donald Tusk, also advocates continuing with this major military expansion. For the Poles, this is a matter of national interest.
The great effort ahead of us, and from which there is no turning back, that is, the increase in spending on armaments and defense. It is a great effort, but there is no turning back from it.
No climate change, no welfare state. The great political consensus in Poland is that they have to rapidly expand their military capabilities. Which brings us directly to a big question. Why does Poland need so many troops in its armed forces? What is behind this titanic military effort? And why are they prioritizing the army? Well, in this video, we're going to talk about two very different things, but ones that are intimately related to each other: strategic plans and weapons. This will help you understand why Poland is spending so much money on defense. And we'll also see other surprising strategies of our times. For example, did you know that there is talk of building a wall, yet not a normal wall, but rather a super armored one, full of technology? Pay close attention.
The East Shield.
We aren't talking about a Game of Thrones style ice wall, but the idea is not so far-fetched. As we were saying, Poland has learned well the lessons of history, and instead of waiting for trouble to come from the east, it's building its own East Shield. We're talking about a wall, a large high-tech wall with anti-tank trenches, surveillance sensors, and anti-drone systems. And while in Westeros, the wall protected the Seven Kingdoms from the White Walkers, here the objective is different: to stop Russia. Now, what exactly is all this about, the East Shield? Well, let's start by talking about numbers, which I can already tell you are vertigo-inducing. The East Shield is a Polish government program to fortify its eastern borders with both Belarus and the Russian enclave of Kaliningrad. The Poles are trying to involve NATO to be part of the project, but whether they succeed or not, one thing is clear: they are determined to see this project through, no matter what it takes. As you can imagine, the costs are not small.
Poland gives details on Eastern Shield to be deployed on Belarusian and Russian borders. The government is to invest 2.3 billion euros in making the border impossible for a potential enemy to cross.
An initial budget of more than $2.5 billion, which, well, you know how these things are, will end up being much more, to super fortify between 400 and 500 kilometers of border, almost the entire border that Poland shares with Russia and Belarus.
Our actions are aimed at defending every inch of our republic's territory.
And as I said, this time we're not only talking about the typical anti-tank ditches, dragon's teeth, and watchtowers. Poland wants the shield to be a technological jewel, capable of protecting the country from the three main Russian threats: heavy artillery, drones, and avalanches of migrants, used as a weapon of hybrid warfare by Russia and Belarus. This strip of about 200 meters wide will have anti-drone towers, seismic sensors, and large gas-filled balloons, which are known as reconnaissance aerostats, that can detect military movements more than 300 kilometers. That's over 185 miles away. But there's even more. This fortification will also include reinforced concrete hedges, bunkers, bridges, and reinforced roads. Spaces have even been set aside for the installation of minefields. We're talking about a combination of physical barriers to slow down or even prevent any enemy incursion. But just in case, the Polish plan also envisages setting up forward operating bases, logistics nodes, and all the necessary infrastructure along the way. What you're looking at is the largest defensive reinforcement of NATO's eastern flank since 1945. The objective is not only to block an attack, but to slow down any enemy movement enough to allow Polish and NATO forces to deploy in sufficient numbers to repel the attack.
We must be prepared for a full-scale conflict of a symmetrical nature and of long duration, and this is related to the fact that we must maintain the armed forces in good condition.
We're talking about a military mega-project supported by 65% of Poles and expected to be operational by 2028. Best of all, this is not an isolated Polish effort. Its neighbors in the Baltic republics, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, are also creating similar border defenses, albeit less comprehensive than this project.
Lithuania opens first anti-mobility equipment park as part of new Baltic defense line.
VisualPolitik community. Since Russia unleashed its horror in Ukraine, the Baltics have started to create their own border defense systems. Lithuania, for example, is building its own border fence with Belarus, a structure that includes not only physical barriers, but also detection and surveillance systems. And if NATO manages to coordinate both projects well, these could function as a single maximum security border mega corridor, capable of protecting Poland, the Baltic countries, and the Suwałki corridor. It is, in essence, a defensive mesh that would buy time. The idea is that under no circumstances should the Russians be able to penetrate NATO soil, neither with uniformed troops nor with mercenaries, at least for the time necessary to mobilize the bulk of the armed forces. Therefore, in addition to physical barriers, logistical corridors are also being developed to facilitate the rapid movement of troops and military equipment, all to avoid a kind of Kursk in Poland or the Baltic republics. Because as we already told you here on VisualPolitik, there is fear that following game theory, there may come a time when Russia may be interested in military action on NATO territory in order to force a negotiation. You think it doesn't make sense? Well, we'll link a video for you in the description where we tell you how this operation could come about. Now, as well as the East Shield, there's still more.
Poland launches Operation Safe Podlasie with 17,000 troops to protect eastern border amid growing hybrid threats.
Since the 1st of August, a combined force of Poles and other NATO allies have been protecting the border with Belarus and training soldiers. And the objective seems basically the same as that of the Shield: to deter Russia and Belarus from surprise attacks, hybrid warfare actions, for example, using immigrants, or lightning operations in the region.
Europe needs strengths again. Building barriers against Russian aggression now can save lives in the future.
Now, all that we have told you is a very, very small part of what Poland is going to spend on defense in the coming years. Because naturally, what would this shield be without weaponry? Well, I can already tell you that in Poland, they aren't stupid, and they will have plenty of weapons and soldiers in a few years' time. Check it out.
Avoiding a Ukraine 2.0.
Imagine for a moment that you are the head of state of a country bordering Russia and Belarus, which for all practical purposes is similar. You are meeting with your cabinet of ministers, and the Minister of Defense asks you, how do we distribute these new funds for the armed forces? Many of you will say, well, that's easy. We divide the new budget in equal parts between the Army, the Air Force, and the Navy. Suddenly, however, the smart-ass consultant on duty asks you a question. But haven't you seen how the Russian invasion of Ukraine went? It was a general invasion, not a specific military operation. So why not invest much more in those who have to protect the territory, the towns and cities, that is, in the land army? What can I say? The question makes all the sense in the world, and it's probably the question that the typical smart-ass advisor asked the Polish Minister of Defense. How exactly did Russia attack Ukraine? What was the Ukrainian armed forces lacking to prevent such an invasion? And from there, they've taken action. Basically, the Polish strategy is to buy in advance everything that Ukraine would have needed from the beginning to repel the Russian invasion. That equates to about 1,000 South Korean K2 tanks, almost 400 American Abrams, about 700 South Korean K9 self-propelled howitzers, almost 300 South Korean Chunmoo rocket launchers, and 500 of the famous HIMARS. Quite a first-rate catalogue. We're talking about a rearmament not seen in Europe in a long time. An army built practically from scratch. That's not all. Another major problem Ukraine has had, and still has today, is its difficulty in protecting itself from Russian airstrikes, many of them directed against civilian areas. We've all seen it, with its Iskander-M missiles, with a range of up to 500 kilometers, or the advanced hypersonic Kh-47s, which can reach targets almost 3,000 kilometers away. Russia has razed homes, as well as civilian and energy infrastructure. Nothing has escaped Russian barbarism, not to mention drones. Russia has used drones in almost 60% of its bombing operations. Now, why have the Russians been able to do all that in Ukraine? Well, purely and simply because of the lack of air defenses. And yes, as you're probably already imagining, the Poles have seen this coming and are also working to address this shortcoming.
Poland beefs up military defenses with purchase of 48 new Patriot launchers.
A total of $15 billion in Patriot batteries alone, and 644 missiles to arm them. Warsaw doesn't mess around. And all this for one simple reason. As in Ukraine, its civilian and energy infrastructure is within range of Russian missiles. Whether fired from Belarus or Kaliningrad, both Iskander and Kh-47s, and many other ordnance could reach virtually the entire country, including, of course, the capital. And let's not forget another small detail.
Iran ships hundreds of ballistic missiles to Russia.
Iran and North Korea, two countries with advanced ballistic capabilities, could support Russia in the event of a conflict against a NATO country, exactly as they are already doing with Ukraine. Now, we left out another area in which Russia is also very strong, and which has been key to invading Ukraine. I am, of course, talking about artillery. Russia not only has a large artillery production, which has also been greatly expanded during the war against Ukraine, it's also buying rockets from Pyongyang. And in view of the difficulties that Ukraine had, particularly in the first year of the war, with the real hail of fire launched by the Russian artillery, Poland also wanted to take the bull by the horns here. At the moment, they are not in inferior conditions, as Ukraine was. HIMARS and Chunmoo would be key in this regard, but so would the more than 800 JASSM air-to-surface cruise missiles, which can accurately hit enemy artillery from a fighter. And it's not just about using the Visa card. Poland is also feeding its own military industry. For example, Uchnik Radom has increased its production of Grot rifles from 17,000 units in March 2022 to 35,000 in 2023, and expects to produce 100,000 by 2026. The objective? To reach the 236,000 rifles produced that the Polish armed forces have ordered to renew their entire stock of rifles. VisualPolitik community, with all that we are telling you, I think one thing has become crystal clear. The Polish ground forces are going to become not only the crown jewel of the country, but probably also the largest ground forces in all of Europe. But of course, here we come to the other big question we were asking at the beginning of the video. What about the Air Force and the Navy? Well, equipping air and maritime forces is much more expensive than equipping the army. A jet fighter or a frigate costs a lot of money, both in terms of equipment and maintenance. But does this mean that Poland has cast aside its air and naval forces? Well, yes and no. Poland's bet is above all to have gigantic ground forces and a huge anti-aircraft defense capable of stopping the Russian onslaught. It would then be up to NATO to provide the rest of the means for a counterattack. Of course, this doesn't mean that Warsaw will be left with antiquities and without air and naval equipment. Not at all.
first F-35 for Poland rolls out of Lockheed's Fort Worth plant.
Warsaw is equipping its air force with 32 F-35s, the creme de la creme of stealth fighters. They are scant, especially compared with everything we've just told you. But from the Polish perspective that we are telling you about, having a small but very high quality air force is more than enough. And it's a very similar story for the Navy. The Poles have launched the Michnik program to build 3 state-of-the-art frigates by 2032. But once again here, we're talking about more contained numbers. So you see, Poland is pulling out all the stops to avoid going down the same path as Ukraine at all costs. The Polish conviction that a Russian attack against them would follow the same pattern as against Ukraine has led to the army being built up on steroids. Warsaw's commitment to defense, its aggressive military modernization, and the construction of the East Shield are not mere gestures, but a clear message. Poland will not repeat the mistakes of the past. There will be no Ukraine 2.0 here. But now we've come this far, the questions are for you. Do you think that all this will be enough to deter Russia? Are the Poles safe from any confrontation with Moscow thanks to this huge expenditure? Well, leave your answers below in the comments and let's start a debate. And very important, if you liked this video, please like it and subscribe to VisualPolitik if you haven't already done so you won't miss any news. As always, thank you very much for being there. All the best. See you next time.